It was supposed to be a normal Sunday. Pancakes, church, and family photos. By dawn, Susan Powell was gone. Her husband said he took their 2 little boys camping in a snowstorm while she slept in. When police entered the house, the carpet was still wet, fans running, and her purse and phone sat untouched. There was blood on the couch, hers, and a saw in the garage that smelled like bleach. Neighbors called it strange. Detectives called it staged. And by the end of that day, a perfect Mormon family had turned into Utah's darkest mystery. This is the story of the woman who vanished into thin air, and the truth that refused to stay buried. Stay with us, because as we dig into what really happened inside the Powell home, the line between love, control, and obsession will vanish too. Sunday evening, December 6th, 2009. The Powells had just returned home from church in West Valley City, Utah. The snow was light, the house warm. Neighbors saw Josh unloading groceries, Susan carrying the boys inside. Nothing unusual. She called her dad, Chuck Cox, her voice steady but tired. "We're fine. Just home from church," she said. It sounded like every other Sunday night. Dinner, dishes, the kids in pajamas. But later that evening, Susan sent one quiet email to a friend. "Josh is acting weird again." It would be the last message she ever sent. Around 10 p.m., the house changed. Neighbors heard a vacuum running, then power tools in the garage. Josh told a friend he was cleaning the carpet before it stains. At midnight, in a snowstorm, one neighbor saw him moving heavy bags to the family minivan. The lights stayed on until nearly 2 a.m. Forensics would later confirm what no one knew then. That carpet carried traces of Susan's blood. At 4 a.m., while the neighborhood slept under a layer of new snow, Josh loaded Charlie, age 4, and Braden, age 2, into the van. He told no one. He drove off into the frozen dark, heading west toward the Simpson Springs desert. The temperature was below 5 degrees. There was no camping gear, no plan, no logic. He would later tell detectives, "We went camping. I didn't know Susan was missing." That trip would become the cornerstone of the entire case. By morning, Susan never showed up for work at Wells Fargo. Her boss called, no answer. Daycare reported both boys absent. Co-workers grew concerned. Susan was never late, never unreachable. Her phone went straight to voicemail. By noon, her father called 911, begging for a welfare check. Police arrived at the Powell home, found the doors locked and the air heavy with the hum of electric fans. The carpet was still damp. The furniture had been moved. No Susan, no children. Just a strange quiet that didn't belong there. At 6 p.m., Josh pulled into the driveway, calm, the boys in the back seat. He told police he had taken them camping overnight. When asked why he left at 4 a.m. in a snowstorm, he said, "The kids wanted s'mores." Officers noted a fresh cut on his hand and bags of cleaning supplies in the garage. They pressed for details. Where did he camp? Who saw him? Why didn't he call? His answers never lined up. Detectives wrote in their notes, "Story inconsistent. Timeline impossible." Inside the house, Susan's purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her jewelry box was untouched. Her car keys were still in the drawer. In Josh's minivan, police found her phone in the cup holder, left behind, unlocked, as if someone wanted it to be found. On the couch, a small patch of blood matched Susan's DNA. A single floor tile had been replaced that morning. The grout was still wet. Police sealed the house, logged evidence, and began treating it as a potential crime scene, not a domestic misunderstanding. That night, her father, Chuck, drove 800 miles from Washington to Utah. He arrived before dawn, pleading with police to search the desert. Volunteers gathered at the church parking lot, printing missing person flyers. Within hours, the story hit every local station. Mormon mother disappears after family camping trip. It was the kind of headline Utah wasn't used to seeing. Wholesome suburb, beautiful young mom, husband's strange story. The coverage exploded nationwide. As search teams combed the frozen plains, Josh stayed home. He refused interviews, avoided cameras, and declined to join the vigils. His silence spoke louder than words. Within days, detectives began comparing timelines. Friends and co-workers gave statements. None matched Josh's version. He couldn't account for his whereabouts between 5 and 9 a.m. His van interior smelled of chemicals, and investigators found burnt fibers near the rear storage area. Cell tower data placed him in the Tooele Desert, the same area where the family camped. His phone was off during the same hours Susan vanished. Detectives obtained search warrants for his digital records, his bank accounts, and his work computer. By the end of that week, the label "missing person" was replaced with something heavier: missing under suspicious circumstances. The shift in tone was quiet but clear. The public no longer hoped Susan had run away. They began to believe she had never left that house alive. Officers who walked through that home described the same feeling. It didn't look like a disappearance. It looked like a cleanup. Friends spoke to the media, recalling how Susan always carried the emotional weight of her family. "She was the glue," one said. "Without her, it was all going to fall apart." As the search dragged on, candlelight vigils filled the streets of West Valley. Families gathered, holding photos of Susan under the cold Utah sky. Her smiling face flickered in the light of hundreds of candles, a reminder that something was terribly wrong behind those closed doors. By the end of December, the house on Sarah Circle no longer felt like a home. The windows were dark, the yard empty, the yellow tape across the door fluttering in the wind. Police quietly removed evidence boxes and vacuum samples. The desert searches slowed under heavy snow. The case entered a new phase. No longer about finding a missing woman, but proving what her husband had done. Before the world started calling her a victim, she was simply Susan, a wife, a mother, and a woman trying to hold her family together. In the next chapter, we uncover who she really was and what she was trying to escape. Susan Marie Cox grew up in the kind of home that shaped steady, dependable people. Born in 1979 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and raised in Puyallup, Washington, she was the daughter of Chuck and Judy Cox, devoted Latter-day Saints who believed in community, kindness, and doing what's right even when it's hard. Susan was the kind of girl people trusted instantly. Friends remembered her as kind, artistic, the one who helped everyone else before thinking of herself. She worked part-time through high school, saved her money, went to church, sang in choir, and dreamed of having a family grounded in faith. By her early 20s, her goals were simple: a stable home, a good marriage, and a life that made sense. She met Josh Powell in 1998 at a church event near Tacoma. He was charming, talkative, smart, the kind of person who filled a room easily. He talked about technology, travel, and his plans for success. He made her feel seen. They started dating quickly, and by the end of that year they were engaged. Friends noticed how fast things moved, but Susan was happy. Josh came from a broken home, a bitter divorce, a father who openly rejected the church. She thought she could bring him peace, maybe even help him believe again. In the beginning, she saw his controlling quirks as harmless. He liked to choose her clothes, plan their schedules, manage the finances. He's just protective, she told friends. But in time, it became clear. He didn't want a partner. He wanted control. They married in April 2001 in the LDS temple. Family photos from that day show wide smiles, but tension beneath them. Josh's parents sat on opposite sides of the room, barely speaking. Even then, people sensed a crack that might widen later. After the wedding, the couple moved to West Valley City, Utah, to start fresh. For a few years, it worked. They bought a modest home, Susan got a steady job at Wells Fargo, and Josh launched a small web design business from home. When their first son, Charlie, was born in 2005, Susan wrote that her life finally felt complete. Braden followed in 2007. The pictures showed family hikes, church potlucks, birthdays, the kind of snapshots that looked like happiness. But as Susan later wrote in her diary, "It's a good life on paper, only on paper." Behind closed doors, money was falling apart. Josh racked up debt on electronics and tools he never used. He became paranoid about privacy, setting up cameras in the house and tracking Susan's computer. Every argument circled back to money, control, and faith. He started taking her paychecks, giving her a few dollars a week for groceries. Friends noticed her stop attending social events, saying Josh didn't want her out too late. She began to shrink her world down. Less contact, fewer visits, careful answers. In one entry she wrote, "He doesn't see me as a partner, only as property." Tension grew worse when Josh's father, Steve Powell, began inserting himself into their lives. He was obsessed with Susan in a way that made everyone uneasy. He filmed her constantly, collecting home videos and zooming in on her face. Later, police would find hundreds of photos of her in his home, images stored in binders and computers, labeled and organized like a shrine. Susan once told a coworker that Steve made comments about how she smelled, how her skin looked in the light. She avoided him whenever she could, but Josh didn't seem to care. He called his father misunderstood. When Steve later told a television reporter, "I was in love with Susan," it confirmed what she'd been afraid to say out loud. She wasn't safe, not even inside her family circle. By 2008, Susan's friends barely saw her. Coworkers described her as distant, like someone who was trying not to make noise in her own home. She told one of them, quietly, "I'm not sure how much longer I can do this." In her journal, the tone shifted from hope to warning. "He's taking control of everything," one entry read. She started hiding cash in her car, preparing for the day she might need to leave quickly. That same year, she drafted a will. In it, she wrote a single, chilling line. "If I die, it may not be an accident." She began looking into apartments, talking to friends about moving out. Her plan was to separate in spring 2010 after saving enough to support the boys. Every sign pointed to a woman trying to rebuild her life, not run away from it. She wanted stability, safety, and a home without fear. But control doesn't let go easily. Those around her saw the shift, the way Josh's temper grew faster, the way her laughter seemed shorter. It was as if she knew she was running out of time. In the weeks before she vanished, she appeared oddly calm, almost relieved, like someone who had made a decision. She cleaned the house, bought small Christmas gifts for coworkers, and organized the boys' clothes. She went to church that last Sunday, December 6, 2009, smiling politely, shaking hands, saying everything was fine. But she left early. That afternoon she called her father, sounding normal but drained. Later, she sent one last message to a friend. 6 simple words that echoed for years afterward. "Josh is acting weird again tonight." When police later looked through her life, they found the same pattern over and over. Kindness, effort, and faith met with control, silence, and fear. Susan Powell didn't disappear out of nowhere. She'd spent years surrounded by red flags no one could pull her away from. The people closest to her tried to believe it was just a rough marriage, not a danger. But her disappearance proved what she'd been writing in her diary all along. She was living beside a man capable of erasing her completely. The woman who vanished wasn't running from her family. She was trying to free it, to create something better for her sons before it was too late. That's why her absence made no sense. Everyone who knew her said the same thing. She would never leave those boys. And that single truth made what came next undeniable. Before the headlines, before the searches, before the years of silence, there was this woman, Susan Powell. A mother who wanted a normal life. A wife who thought love could fix everything. In the next chapter, investigators begin to pull apart the story her husband built. And every secret he tried to bury starts to surface. Within 2 days of Susan Powell's disappearance, police stopped calling it a search. They called it what it was, a suspicious disappearance. Detectives returned to the Powell home with forensic teams, photographing, marking, collecting. The carpet was still damp. It smelled of bleach. Fans were running in every room, blowing air across the floor. One tile section near the couch looked freshly replaced. When officers sprayed luminol, it glowed, a light blue haze on the grout and fabric. Blood. The samples were sent to the state crime lab. From that moment, the focus shifted from finding Susan to finding what happened inside that house. Investigators began piecing together Josh Powell's movements between midnight and sunrise on December 7th. His story didn't hold. There were no camping receipts, no gas station records, no witness who saw him with the boys. The desert was frozen that night, -5 degrees. Detectives looked at each other, and one said what everyone already knew. "We're not looking for a lost mother. We're looking for a crime scene." When the lab results came back, the blue glow meant something now. The blood on the couch matched Susan Powell's DNA. Carpet fibers tested positive for bleach and ammonia. In the garage, officers found a tile saw with a blade covered in dust and partial human DNA. A faint burn ring on the concrete floor suggested the saw had been used recently. In the trash, there were wet cleaning rags, a half-empty bottle of hydrogen peroxide, and one disposable glove. The timeline tightened. Cleanup likely took place between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. The missing tile became the key no one could explain. An officer later said quietly, "This wasn't panic. It was cleanup." Digital forensics filled in what Josh tried to erase. Cell phone records placed him in the Tooele Desert between 4 and 9 that morning, miles from any campsite. His phone had been turned off, something he never did. GPS data showed multiple stops along empty dirt roads. Computer history revealed searches for Utah mine shafts, how deep to bury, and decomposition in winter. Detectives traced Susan's phone activity, last used at 10:15 p.m. that Sunday night. The next morning, her voicemail was accessed once from inside their house under Josh's login. Search dogs later alerted to human scent in the minivan's trunk. Investigators began mapping possible routes, measuring fuel use, matching tire patterns to desert access points. Then came a discovery that changed everything. Inside a locked box in the bedroom closet, they found Susan's handwritten will and a folded note. The paper was creased from being opened many times. It read, "If I die, it may not be an accident. I've been afraid for my safety for a long time." Handwriting experts confirmed it was hers. The letter matched what she'd written in her diary and told coworkers. She feared Josh, and she feared what would happen if she left him. Detectives handed the note to the district attorney. One investigator said, "It's not a suicide letter. It's testimony." That was the moment the case crossed the line from missing person to probable homicide. Josh Powell's behavior did the rest. He refused a polygraph, saying he didn't trust the police. He declined interviews, claiming the media were exploiting his family. At candlelight vigils, he stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in pockets, eyes flat. A friend said, he looked bored while people cried. Within a week, he emptied Susan's 401k account, canceled her phone, and locked her email. He hired a defense attorney before the police even named him as a suspect. Detectives noted how quickly the role of worried husband became protected individual. Public sympathy shifted fast. People no longer asked if Susan had run away. They asked when Josh would be arrested. In January 2010, he left Utah. He packed up his 2 sons and moved back to Washington to live with his father, Steve Powell. He told reporters the police were harassing him and that Utah was toxic. Investigators saw it differently. He was distancing himself from the crime scene. West Valley detectives contacted Pierce County and the FBI. A joint task force began quietly watching the Powell home in Puyallup. Neighbors described it as curtains closed, no sound, no toys in the yard. The case spread nationwide. Dateline, Nancy Grace, and 48 Hours all ran segments titled, "Where is Susan Powell?" Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, appeared on morning shows pleading, "Please tell us where our daughter is." Josh said nothing. He ignored every call from media and police. Volunteers searched the desert, more than 1,000 people covering 80 square miles of frozen land. Police released new photos, the blood-stained tile, the van interior, the missing grout section. The public demanded an arrest, but prosecutors held back. "We can't prosecute a ghost story," the district attorney said. "We need a body." As pressure mounted, Josh tried to control the narrative. He created a personal blog claiming Susan was depressed, that she might have left to escape stress. He uploaded old smiling photos with captions like, "She needed freedom." Investigators called it manipulation. Journalists labeled it digital gaslighting. The blog drew outrage. Readers flooded it with angry comments. Within a week, Josh deleted the entire page. The damage was done. The public had made up its mind. Police issued a statement naming him officially Joshua Powell, the only person of interest in the disappearance of Susan Powell. By March 2010, the forensics were complete. Susan's DNA was confirmed in 3 separate locations inside the house. Luminol patterns showed movement, consistent with dragging a body from the living room toward the garage. In the motor housing of the tile saw, technicians found microscopic traces of her blood. The conclusion read plainly: high probability of homicide within the residence. The report was sealed, but leaked months later, and the story ignited again. Josh called the science fabricated, but even skeptics stopped believing in coincidence. For the first time, the case didn't feel like a mystery. It felt like evidence waiting for a trial that hadn't yet begun. A friend told reporters, "She was trying to leave, and that's what killed her." Detectives agreed. Every clue circled back to the same place, that quiet suburban home on Sarah Circle. What began as a missing persons search had become one of Utah's most haunting domestic homicide cases. Each tile, each phone log, each inconsistent word told the same story. The truth was inside that house from the start. And with every new piece of evidence, investigators were getting closer to proving it. Before long, the question was no longer, where is Susan Powell? It was, how much longer can Josh keep pretending he doesn't know? After Susan Powell disappeared, investigators turned their focus to the people who surrounded Josh, especially his father, Steve Powell. Josh had moved back into Steve's house in Puyallup, Washington, bringing his two sons with him. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary suburban home, but neighbors described something else. They said the blinds were always closed, the kids were rarely seen, and the energy around the house felt heavy. Detectives soon realized that control and secrecy weren't just Josh's traits. They were the family's legacy. Steve Powell had always been the center of that control. His old journals revealed a man obsessed with dominance and resentment, particularly toward women. He wrote pages about obedience and submission, about faith being a tool to manage others. His children grew up under emotional manipulation. Affection was earned. Privacy didn't exist. Steve decided what they could watch, who they could date, and even what they could believe. Josh learned early that love meant control. To him, people weren't partners. They were projects. Then detectives uncovered something that turned their suspicion into horror. During a search of Steve's home in 2011, they found hundreds of photos and videos of Susan. Some looked like regular family moments. Others were taken secretly, zoomed in, printed, and labeled. Investigators found recordings of her voice, old tissues, lip balm, even strands of her hair kept in plastic bags. On his computer were folders labeled Susan Personal, Susan Songs, Susan Memories. In his journals, Steve wrote, "I think Susan feels my love, even if she denies it." He fantasized about her daily. Former friends said he often talked about her as if she belonged to him. When asked years later on camera, Steve calmly said, "I was in love with Susan." The confession shocked the country, but detectives had already seen the evidence. What they uncovered wasn't love, it was obsession. To understand Josh, they had to understand where he came from. His siblings later described their home as a dictatorship. Punishments were public, arguments never ended, and everyone lived under Steve's control. Money, faith, affection, everything was conditional. That mindset followed Josh into adulthood. He married Susan, moved to Utah, and repeated every pattern he'd learned. He managed her finances, monitored her calls, and dictated what she could wear. Friends noticed how he'd praise her in public, then quietly correct her later. One of them said, he didn't see her as a person. He saw her as something he owned. The cycle became clearer when police raided Steve's home. In August 2011, they executed a search warrant that led to a discovery few could stomach. Along with Susan's photos, officers found thousands of images of neighborhood children, voyeuristic footage, and explicit material involving minors. They also seized detailed journals describing Steve's sexual fantasies about women, including his daughter-in-law. He was arrested immediately and charged with child pornography and voyeurism. The headlines were explosive. Father of missing woman's husband arrested on child porn charges. For the public, it confirmed what investigators already suspected. The Powell household was not just dysfunctional. It was dangerous. If this was the father, people asked, what had the son become? In the months after the raid, Washington Child Protective Services reviewed Josh's living conditions. With his father in jail, Josh rented a small home a few miles away. Reports described him as unstable, angry one moment, withdrawn the next. The Cox family filed for custody of the boys, arguing that Josh's behavior and the environment he created were unsafe. The court agreed, granting custody to Susan's parents and limiting Josh to supervised visits. Social workers documented his mood swings. One wrote, "He goes from calm to furious in seconds." Another noted how he'd talk to the children about police lying and destroying the family. He blamed everyone but himself. Meanwhile, detectives continued their work quietly, still hoping to find physical evidence of Susan's body. During those supervised visits, the children began to say things that made investigators stop cold. 4-year-old Charlie told relatives, "Mommy was in the trunk." 2-year-old Braden added, "Mommy stayed where the crystals are." The words were reported to police and recorded in CPS files. Detectives believed the crystals might refer to Utah's Crystal Caves or the desert mine shafts Josh had searched online months before. The boys were too young to explain, but their words fit the timeline. Search teams returned to Utah's desert again, combing through old mines. They found nothing, but those fragments of memory stayed in the case file, haunting everyone who read them. By late 2011, Josh's world was collapsing. He withdrew from church, cut off his neighbors, and kept the boys close, never letting them play outside. Caseworkers described the home as empty of life. The furniture was minimal, the air tense. He refused counseling, polygraph tests, or cooperation with police. In public, he smiled for cameras when asked about Susan. In private, he wrote angry emails defending his father and attacking Susan's family for ruining his life. Investigators saw the pattern, a man raised in control, now consumed by it. Like his father, he couldn't accept that the world wouldn't bend to him. His spiral mirrored Steve's, a descent into bitterness, paranoia, and obsession. Meanwhile, the Cox family fought through exhaustion and grief. They continued holding vigils and speaking at churches. They built websites and handed out flyers even though most people already knew her name. Chuck Cox said quietly, "I still believe we'll find her, but I know she's gone." For them, the tragedy wasn't just losing Susan. It was watching the system allow Josh to keep seeing his sons. Both Utah and Washington investigators traded evidence constantly. The file was thick, but without a body, prosecutors couldn't move forward. One detective said, "We know what happened. We just can't prove where faith leaders in both states began openly discussing domestic violence inside religious communities." One pastor said during a vigil, "Evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows in the house next door." By the end of the year, frustration filled every corner of the investigation. Forensics tied nearly everything to Josh, his lies, his cleaning, his digital searches. But the lack of a body stopped everything cold. Prosecutors feared that filing a murder charge without remains could risk the entire case. Detectives hated it. One said, "We just need a body." Months passed. Media coverage slowed. Public anger faded into silence. For the first time since Susan vanished, the story felt still, like it had frozen in place. But the investigators closest to the case said it never stopped feeling dangerous. Josh Powell was cornered, isolated, and angry. And though no one could see what was coming next, they all felt it. The sense that something far worse was waiting just ahead. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the pause before everything burned. By February 2012, Josh Powell was a father under court supervision. His wife was missing, his father was in prison, and his 2 young sons were the only connection left to the family he once controlled. Child Protective Services had limited his contact to brief, supervised visits at his rented home in Graham, Washington. On paper, it looked safe. There was always a social worker present, and every minute was logged. But behind that structure, every warning light was flashing. Case files described him as volatile and unpredictable. One supervisor wrote, "He remains calm during visits, but his fixation on control hasn't changed." Still, the court approved continued visits, citing insufficient threat documentation. The assumption was simple. Supervised meant safe. It wasn't. February 5, 2012, began like any other Sunday. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, helped Charlie and Braden get ready. The boys were cheerful. Braden, age 5, zipped his jacket himself for the first time. At 12:30 p.m., CPS caseworker Elizabeth Griffin Hall drove them to Josh's home. The small gray house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by trees and winter fog. Nothing about it warned what was about to happen. When they arrived, Josh opened the door smiling. "Hey guys, come on in." The boys ran forward, laughing. Elizabeth followed, clipboard in hand. But as she stepped up to the threshold, Josh turned, blocking her path. He looked straight at her, expression flat, unreadable, and closed the door. She heard the lock click. Seconds later came the smell of gasoline. Elizabeth pounded on the door, shouting for him to open it. Inside, she heard a muffled cry, then silence. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "There's an explosion!" she screamed. "The kids are inside! He locked me out!" Before the operator could respond, the line filled with noise, the sound of shattering glass and roaring fire. The blast ripped through the house. Neighbors later said it sounded like thunder at ground level. Flames tore upward, black smoke twisting into the gray sky. The fire spread instantly, fed by accelerants placed throughout the rooms. Witnesses saw the roof lift before collapsing in on itself. Within minutes, first responders arrived, but the heat was too intense. Propane tanks near the garage ignited, sending fireballs across the yard. Elizabeth stood in the street, crying, unable to speak. Fire crews could only surround the blaze and wait. When it was finally extinguished an hour later, nothing remained but the foundation and charred debris. Inside, investigators found 2 5-gallon gasoline cans, melted metal fragments of a torch, and the outline of 3 bodies near the center of the house. Josh was in the middle. His sons were beside him. Autopsy reports confirmed what detectives feared. The boys had suffered hatchet wounds before the explosion. The fire had not killed them instantly. It had been meant to erase evidence. The attack was premeditated, carried out in seconds. Emails sent minutes before the blast filled in the rest. One to his attorney read, "I'm sorry. Goodbye." Another to relatives said only, I can't do this anymore. Police traced his final phone call to a blank voicemail left seconds before ignition. The Pierce County Sheriff summarized it later. This wasn't rage. This was a plan. Investigators found more proof of intent in the ashes. His computer contained searches from the previous week. Combustion point of gasoline. How to start fire fast. Explosive mixtures. He had withdrawn all remaining funds from his bank account 2 days earlier and mailed a will-like document to his attorney. It read, "I'm sorry for the pain. Please keep my story alive." Forensic teams concluded the accelerant had been spread throughout the house hours before the visit. Josh had known exactly when the social worker would arrive, how long it would take to reach the door, and how quickly the house would burn. Every second had been measured. When news of the explosion reached the Cox family, the silence was immediate and unbearable. Chuck Cox's only statement to reporters was short. He wanted control until the end. He made sure we lost everything. That night, candlelight vigils appeared in both Puyallup and Salt Lake City. Strangers gathered with photos of Susan, Charlie, and Braden. Local newscasts opened the same way. He killed them to erase her. Across the country, people who had followed the disappearance for years asked the same question. How did this happen again? In plain sight. Child Protective Services came under immediate fire. Records showed caseworkers had raised concerns about Josh's behavior, his mood swings, his obsession with control. But each warning was dismissed as non-threatening during supervision. One memo read, "He is unstable but compliant." No one imagined he would use his final visit to stage a murder-suicide. Law enforcement agencies in Utah, still investigating Susan's disappearance, understood what the fire truly meant. The explosion was not an isolated act of despair. It was closure, on Josh's terms. He had silenced the only witnesses who could have spoken about what happened the night their mother vanished. In the following days, the national media descended on Graham. Satellite trucks lined the street. Cameras framed the scorched lot where the house had stood. Reporters repeated the same words. This was preventable. Commentators called it one of the most devastating failures in the history of child protection oversight. Politicians in Washington and Utah promised immediate reviews of visitation policy. CPS officials held press conferences, admitting the procedures had not accounted for intentional harm during supervised contact. Behind the official statements, investigators could see the truth. Paperwork had replaced intuition. The final scene that reporters focused on wasn't the fire itself, but what it left behind. 2 small bicycles stood near the edge of the property, half covered in ash, their frames bent but recognizable. They became the image every network used, the symbol of innocence lost to control. In the weeks that followed, thousands attended memorials for Charlie and Braden. At one service, a pastor said softly, he thought the fire would end her story. Instead, it made sure the world would never stop telling it. For detectives, the explosion ended all doubt. Susan Powell was no runaway, no mystery. She was a murder victim. Her husband had destroyed the last pieces of evidence, his sons, to keep it that way. The ashes cooled, but the outrage didn't. Across the country, people asked the same question. How many warnings had been ignored before it burned? The fire marked the moment when a family's tragedy became a national reckoning. It was no longer just about one missing woman. It was about the system that had failed to see danger until it exploded. The flames died that day, but the investigation did not. What remained was the hunt for accountability, and the growing realization that Susan Powell's case was never only about what happened in her home. It was about how far control could go when no one stopped it. In the months after the explosion, there was no longer any question about what had happened to Susan Powell. The tragedy had burned away every illusion of uncertainty. Both Utah and Washington police formally reclassified her disappearance as homicide, connected to domestic violence. The investigation that had once focused on search teams and missing person flyers shifted entirely to reconstruction. The goal was no longer rescue, but record building. Detectives reopened every file from 2009. The FBI joined the Utah Attorney General's office in reviewing old evidence that had been shelved or ignored. Boxes of reports, photographs, and hard drives were hauled out of storage. A detective summed it up quietly. "We're not searching for hope anymore. We're building the record." Digital forensics specialists began with Josh Powell's computers, long since impounded. Inside, they found deleted browser histories and cached text fragments. Search terms read like confessions: mineshaft Utah, how deep to bury a body, winter decomposition rates. GPS data from his minivan showed multiple overnight trips to the Tooele Desert and Simpson Springs in the days after Susan vanished. Satellite tracking confirmed the same pattern of movement. Investigators overlaid the data, creating a geo-timeline that traced his routes across miles of open desert. The likely disposal zone shrank from hundreds of miles to just 20. At the same time, advances in forensic testing allowed the lab to revisit old samples. Between 2012 and 2015, technicians retested blood traces collected from the Powell home. DNA results confirmed what had once been labeled inconclusive. The blood on the couch and floor matched Susan. Luminol tests mapped a faint trail leading from the living room toward the garage. A broken tile, preserved in storage, showed deep cut marks from a power saw. Recreation software allowed investigators to model the crime minute by minute. The final report concluded with quiet certainty: high probability of homicide inside the Powell residence. December 6, 2009. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit took over the psychological reconstruction. Agents reviewed years of family documents, journals, and emails. They defined Josh's behavior as a textbook case of coercive control, escalating to lethal violence. Financial records revealed that he had withdrawn nearly all of Susan's savings, canceled her insurance, and attempted to liquidate assets before moving to Washington. Then came one of the most chilling discoveries: deleted email exchanges between Josh and his father, Steve. Recovered fragments included one line that investigators covered: "They'll never find her. She's in God's hands now." For agents, it confirmed that both men knew Susan was dead, and that her body had been hidden long before the investigation began. Steve Powell's own life ended as darkly as it had been lived. In 2015, he was convicted on charges of child pornography and voyeurism after hundreds of secret recordings and images were found in his home. During trial, prosecutors described his obsession with Susan as the seed of the family's dysfunction. He refused to testify, showing no emotion even as the evidence was read aloud. In 2018, shortly after his release, he died of heart failure. Chuck Cox, Susan's father, said simply, "Two Powells gone. Two still missing." For the Cox family, Steve's death closed a chapter, but not the book. Meanwhile, attention turned to the institutions that had failed to stop the chain of events. In 2013, the state of Washington ordered a full audit of its child protection procedures. The report detailed systemic failures, no mental health evaluations, no risk assessments, and little communication between agencies. One reviewer wrote, "Policy was followed. Judgment was missing." The audit became the foundation for later reform. It recommended psychological evaluations for any parent under active investigation before visitation rights could resume. Public anger shifted from grief to accountability. As the story spread again through the media, major outlets revisited the case. Dateline produced When Warnings Fail. True crime podcasts retold the timeline in forensic detail, emphasizing how every red flag had been visible years before the murders. Advocacy groups launched #JusticeForSusan, calling for stronger domestic violence prevention laws. The case was now more than a tragedy. It was a national study in how systems collapse when they rely on procedure over instinct. In 2017, West Valley City Police Chief Colleen Jacobs faced reporters at a press conference and admitted what many already knew. "We missed every warning sign," she said. "We had evidence, but not enough imagination." Her department reopened several old search zones using new ground-penetrating radar, hoping to locate Susan's remains. Nothing was found, but the effort mattered. The case was added to Utah's official police training curriculum, taught as an example of investigative perseverance and human cost. By 2019, the Utah Attorney General's office issued the final statement. Evidence supports homicide by Joshua Powell. Investigation complete. The words were bureaucratic but final. No body, no prosecution, just documentation. For Chuck and Judy Cox, it was confirmation, not comfort. "We didn't get justice," Chuck said quietly. "We got proof." The FBI kept Susan's profile active in the missing persons database, a symbolic act to ensure her name would remain searchable, visible, and never erased. Her case became part of training seminars across the country, used to teach officers how coercive control escalates, how early signs matter, and how procedure can sometimes hide danger. As the files closed, the evidence boxes were sealed and labeled, "Powell Case Complete." Detectives who had spent years on it said they could still hear her story in the silence of the lab, the sound of a case that had ended too late, but ended in truth. Public voices and news anchors echoed across broadcasts. "We missed her signals. How many more will it take?" The same question repeated in every newsroom, every policy meeting, every vigil that followed. In the Cox family home, photographs of Susan and her sons lined the mantel. Candles burned beneath them each December. The tone of remembrance had changed. Not grief, but resolve. From ash and evidence, investigators had rebuilt the truth piece by piece. It hadn't brought peace, but it brought clarity. The story of Susan Powell no longer belonged to the unknown. It stood as proof of what happens when warning signs are ignored, and as a reminder that justice sometimes arrives years late, not as a verdict, but as understanding. The truth was finally visible, and now the next battle would move to the courtroom, where the system itself would have to stand trial. After nearly a decade of silence, the Cox family made one final move. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state of Washington and its Child Protective Services Division. The claim was simple and devastating: gross negligence. CPS, they argued, had allowed Josh Powell to keep seeing his sons even when every warning light was flashing red. The legal filings listed 10 separate red flags, each one ignored, before the day of the explosion. The case drew national attention the moment it was filed. It wasn't just about one family. It was about how a system built to protect children had done the opposite. In early 2020, the trial began in Pierce County Superior Court. The room was silent, lined with reporters and domestic violence advocates who had followed the Powell story for years. At the front, Chuck and Judy Cox sat side by side, photographs of Susan, Charlie, and Braden placed on the table in front of them. The state's attorneys opened by insisting that CPS had followed procedure, that their social workers did everything the rules required. The Cox family's lawyers didn't argue with that. Instead, they replied, "Procedure isn't protection. Children died because no one wanted to act." Judge Kathleen Webster presided calmly, knowing every word spoken would echo far beyond the courtroom. Then came the witnesses. Former CPS caseworkers took the stand, one after another. Some trembled. One said quietly, "I felt something was wrong, but policy tied my hands." Another explained that she had requested a psychological evaluation for Josh Powell weeks before the explosion. It was denied. Emails were displayed on a screen for the jury. One, dated January 27, 2012, read, "He's compliant on paper but emotionally unstable. Proceed with caution." Less than 2 weeks later, 2 boys were dead. The words hit the courtroom like a verdict before the verdict. Expert testimony followed. Forensic psychologists explained that coercive, controlling abusers often appear cooperative in official settings. They pointed to over 50 similar cases nationwide, where strict procedural checklists failed to identify risk. Charts and reports filled the monitors, a picture of a system built for efficiency, not safety. The state's defense began to crumble. Attorneys tried to argue that the tragedy couldn't have been predicted, but the evidence, the emails, the reports, the ignored evaluations, told a different story. Finally, a senior CPS official took the stand and admitted, "Our process failed to measure risk. It only measured compliance." The courtroom went still. It was the first public acknowledgement that the state bore responsibility. 3 weeks later, the jury deliberated. It took them less than a day. When they returned, every juror's face carried the same expression: somber, resolved. The foreperson read the verdict aloud. "We find the state of Washington grossly negligent in its duty to protect Charles and Braden Powell." The damages were set at $100 million, one of the largest child welfare verdicts in U.S. history. The judge spoke slowly as she read her closing statement. The state had knowledge. The state had warning. The state failed to act. In the front row, Chuck Cox lowered his head. There were no cheers, no gasps, just quiet tears. "This won't bring them back," he said afterward. "But it might save others." Within months, the Washington State Legislature drafted Senate Bill 5163, later known as the Powell Law. The bill required full psychological evaluations for any parent under active investigation before supervised visitation could be approved. It also mandated immediate coordination between child protection services and law enforcement in domestic violence cases. When the governor signed the bill, a single photo of Susan and her boys sat beside the documents. The governor's statement was brief. "This law exists because a family paid the price for our delay." Across the country, the reaction was swift. News outlets ran the headline, "Justice for the Ones We Lost." Domestic violence shelters reported increased funding. Training programs were updated to include the Powell case as required study. For the first time, reform followed tragedy. Documentaries called it a system learning too late. Podcasts and journalists revisited the evidence, pointing out how nearly every warning sign had been visible years earlier. What began as a cold case had become a national blueprint for change. The Cox family began speaking publicly, attending law enforcement seminars and policy conferences. Chuck told officers, "Paperwork isn't protection. People are." His words became a quiet mantra within CPS circles. At a vigil that winter, hundreds gathered in Salt Lake City. Candlelight flickered against a banner that read, "Her story changed the law." The verdict also transformed the legal landscape. Attorneys across the U.S. cited Cox v. State of Washington in new cases involving agency negligence. Universities added the trial to criminal justice and social work curriculums. CPS training manuals incorporated excerpts from the ruling itself, especially the line that defined the failure. Compliance without caution is neglect. For investigators, the Powell case shifted from a cautionary tale to a professional obligation. The message was clear. Trust instinct as much as protocol. If something feels wrong, act before it's too late. By the end of 2020, the courtroom was empty again. The lights dimmed. A single folder sat on the bench labeled Cox versus State of Washington, verdict rendered. Justice hadn't arrived with one grand revelation. It had been built the same way the truth had been. One document, one testimony, one admission at a time. It wasn't revenge. It was repair. Outside, snow fell softly as Chuck and Judy stepped out into the flash of cameras. He held a framed photo of Susan and the boys. For the first time in years, his voice was steady. Now the law remembers her name. The case was over, but its echo had just begun. From that courtroom forward, every agency, every judge, every caseworker who read the Powell file would remember what it cost to wait too long. Justice had finally come, not in a sentence or a punishment, but in a change written into law. And in that law, Susan Powell's name would live, attached not to tragedy anymore, but to prevention. The doors of the courthouse closed behind them. The snow kept falling. The applause faded into silence. And what remained was a single truth: that justice on paper is only the beginning. After the verdict, when the headlines began to fade, Chuck and Judy Cox made a decision. Their daughter's story couldn't end inside a courtroom file. In 2021, they founded the Susan Powell Foundation in Utah, a nonprofit built not from victory but from loss. Its mission was simple: to help families facing domestic violence find protection, legal guidance, and hope. The foundation's logo showed a single candle, its flame steady against the dark. The motto read, "From silence to safety." Donations came quietly at first, from friends, neighbors, church members, even retired investigators who had worked the original case. The press called it the quiet legacy of Susan Powell. Within a year, the foundation opened its first support centers in Salt Lake City and Spokane. Their first program, Safe Path, trained women on how to document abuse, understand restraining orders, and stay safe during separation. A 24-hour hotline went live that spring. By December, it had fielded over 3,000 calls. Volunteer lawyers processed more than 200 emergency protection orders. When reporters asked why they built it, Chuck said simply, "If the system moves too slow, we'll build one that doesn't." From there, the mission spread. The foundation began collaborating with national partners, like the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the Utah Domestic Safety Coalition. Together, they organized a conference titled Lessons from the Powell Case. Delegates from 40 states attended: social workers, police chiefs, prosecutors, and judges. The discussion wasn't about blame anymore. It was about prevention. Sessions focused on the red flags that were missed: coercive control, psychological manipulation, gaps between agencies. One retired judge summed it up. "Her case taught us that protocol without urgency kills." Within a year, 12 states adopted their own versions of the Powell Law. Every December 6th, the day Susan vanished, Utah cities now hold the Candlelight Vigil for Change. Streets fill with hundreds of people holding candles and photos of loved ones lost to domestic violence. In high schools across the state, students participate in the new Safe Home Initiative, a program teaching teenagers about healthy relationships and early signs of abuse. Judy Cox began visiting classrooms herself. Standing before students, she told them, "My daughter didn't live to see this change, but it's hers." After each talk, students wrote messages and pinned them to the walls. For Susan, we speak up. By 2023, Susan's story returned to the screen, this time not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. Netflix released The Vanishing Wife, a docuseries seen by millions. The podcast Justice Rebuilt aired an 8-part series on the investigation and the legal reform that followed. Listeners wrote in, "This story changed how I see silence." Dateline revisited the family, filming them at a shoreline memorial, laying flowers beside the water. The closing voiceover said simply, "She didn't live to see change. She became the reason for it." It was no longer about a disappearance. It was about what society learned from it. Legislators across the country took note. After the Powell Law in Washington, states like Oregon, Idaho, and Colorado passed similar bills, requiring mandatory risk assessments in custody cases involving domestic violence. Congress held hearings on a national version, the Safe Custody Act, modeled directly on the Powell case. Advocates began referring to Susan as the woman whose case changed custody law. Time magazine wrote, "It took one family's tragedy to move a nation's conscience." By 2024, the Susan Powell Foundation had reached over 1,200 families nationwide. It funded self-defense workshops, trauma recovery programs, and legal aid for victims in rural counties. A portion of donations went to the Charlie and Braden Scholarship Fund, supporting children who lost parents to domestic violence. Letters poured in. One mother wrote, "Because of Susan, my daughter is still alive." Another said, "You turned her story into a lifeline for people like me." For the Cox family, those words mattered more than any verdict. The foundation had become a blueprint for 30 other nonprofits now operating under similar models. The impact spread beyond legal reform. On social media, campaigns like #JusticeForSusan and #SafeHomesAct went viral, drawing millions of views and reposts. Influencers, police officers, and survivors told the story again and again, not to reopen wounds, but to keep the lessons alive. Billboards appeared along Utah highways. Some disappearances start at home. Let's end that. Calls to domestic violence hotlines across the state rose by 28% over the next 2 years. Every new report meant someone had found the courage to speak, and that Susan's name still meant safety for someone else. Meanwhile, the Cox family continued their work quietly. They still lived in the same small house in Puyallup. Each week, they sorted through stacks of mail, thank you notes, donation letters, stories from strangers who had been helped by the foundation. They didn't seek fame or attention. "We just want to make sure no one else has to wait for the police to arrive too late," Chuck said. At every annual vigil, Judy lit 3 candles. One for Susan, one for Charlie, one for Braden. She never gave a speech. She just stood there, smiling softly through the glow. Someone once asked her why she kept doing it after all these years. Her answer was quiet but firm. "They're still helping." Over time, that image became the symbol of the entire movement. Not grief, not revenge, but endurance. The calm persistence of a family who refused to let their story end where it broke. By then, the Susan Powell Foundation had become more than a charity. It was a reminder, written into public policy, education, and everyday awareness. Proof that a single case could transform how an entire country thought about protection and responsibility. The power of the movement wasn't in its noise, but in its constancy. One candle, then hundreds, then thousands, lighting up cities that once only knew her name as a headline. When people spoke of Susan Powell now, they didn't say, "the missing woman." They said, "the reason we changed." And for Chuck and Judy Cox, that was enough. Their daughter's story had become something the system could no longer ignore, something stronger than tragedy, a structure rebuilt from it. It began with loss, but it ended in reform. What had once been silence now carried a voice that reached across states, classrooms, and courtrooms. Steady, human, and clear. Her legacy lived in laws, in lessons, and in lives that continued because hers was taken too soon. And as each December came, the candles returned, not as symbols of mourning, but of the promise she left behind. 13 years have passed since that cold December night. It's 2022 now. The country has changed. New laws, new leaders, new headlines. But one question still echoes quietly through every missing person broadcast. Where is Susan Powell? Her name remains on the national database of the missing, even though everyone knows she will never be found that way. What was once a simple listing has become a symbol, not of mystery, but of warning. A reminder of how many voices are silenced long before anyone notices they're gone. On a recent Dateline interview, Chuck Cox sits in his living room. Behind him, framed photos of Susan and the two boys. His hands rest on his knees, his tone calm, steady. "I still believe we'll find her," he says. "Maybe not the way we hope, but I believe." The reporter asks what keeps him going. Chuck pauses. Because silence lets it happen again. Talking about her keeps others alive. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The weight of his words fills the room. The search is no longer about discovery. It's about continuation. Across Utah, the work that bears Susan's name continues quietly. The Safe Path Centers stay open late into the night, offering legal advice and shelter to anyone who needs it. Students in classrooms hold up signs reading #Justice for Susan. At the Foundation's office, scholarships are handed out in the names of Charlie and Braden, to children who lost parents to domestic violence. Every December, hundreds gather at the lake for the candlelight vigil for change. The candles flicker against the snow, their reflections trembling on the water. A line appears on every screen that night. Every year, more than 1,000 Americans vanish due to domestic violence. No music, no narration. Just wind, breath, and silence. In police academies and law schools, her case has become a core lesson. Officers studying domestic crime response know it by heart, not because of what was proven, but because of what was missed. A young recruit says in a training session, "We study her case to remember what not to miss." A law student adds, "She's part of our textbook now." The chapter called Accountability. Susan Powell no longer lives in breaking news segments. She lives in policies, in reforms, in the minds of those sworn to prevent another story like hers. Back in Puyallup, the Cox family leads a smaller, quieter life. The lawsuits are over. The interviews have stopped. Their focus now is the foundation and the annual memorial every December. In their living room, a small box holds what's left of Susan's belongings. A few photos, a birthday card, and a scrap of fabric from the old house in West Valley. Judy once said, "It's not closure, it's acceptance." They don't wait for miracles anymore. They keep her alive in the work they do, in every person they help save from what she could not escape. Across the country, her name appears again, not on case files, but in public service campaigns. Each year, national domestic violence awareness ads begin with the same words. Justice isn't always a verdict. Sometimes it's a law, a lesson, a legacy. That line, now part of countless awareness programs, captures what Susan's story became. She's no longer the woman who disappeared. She's the reason people pay attention. If this story moved you, take a moment to keep it alive. Hit like so more people can see Susan's story. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries that reveal the truth behind silence. And tell us in the comments, what part of Susan's story stayed with you the most? Your thoughts, your voice, and your awareness help make sure that stories like hers are never forgotten.